thoughtful ideas and suggestions for guests and topics.
Great events, programs, and
Welcome to this week's segment of Dialogue Houston. I'm your host, Lawrence Payne. To our regular viewing audience, welcome. To those joining us perhaps here for the first time for HCC's TV Dialogue Houston, we can be found now every Tuesday and Thursday at 6 a.m. and again at 6 p.m. and Saturday afternoons at 3 p.m. As always, at the top of the hour, let me thank you for your thoughtful calls, emails, and text messages concerning previous shows and guests we've had here on Dialogue Houston, but particularly your great ideas for topics and guests and subjects to be covered on upcoming segments of Dialogue Houston. For after all, this is your community affairs, public affairs show here on ACC TV, proudly beginning its 29th season. We have a great show planned for you today. It is a timely one with a timely guest and issue around this divided world we're in, divided society, divided nation, divided in every way you can think about. And it is the idea of what can theology do. And the theology is a study of what can theology do to bring us into some kind of harmony, some kind of close proximity with each other as fellow human beings. I know of no better person to help explore that discussion this afternoon than my good friend, the Reverend Dr. Fred D. Smith, who is really a practitioner in something we call leadership in public theology and theology in the city. Before we all were forced to shut down with COVID, in April 2018, he put on a wonderful conference, probably the best that's ever been, around how do you wed the issue of health and education and theology and social and economic and political strands. How do you all use and see those interconnected, interrelated, interdependent on each other, and do it from an interdisciplinary perspective, from kind of not only an academic perspective, but a realistic, practical, everyday perspective. And it was a wonderful conference. So Fred, welcome. So good to have you here and to have you part of this today. So here we go. Yeah, we got a lot to talk about.
Yes, sir.
So tell us the concept and the crux of what it means to be talking about leadership in public theology and theology in the city.
Okay, I want to begin with the concept. I've heard you speak before about the beloved community. And beloved community is really the foundation of public theology that I take in that as an approach. One of the things that had always been fascinating to me was when Jesus in the chapter of Luke, I think it's chapter 10:25, and the lawyer stood up and asked him a question, well, what is the greatest commandment? He said it's to love God with all your heart, mind, soul, and strength, and your neighbor as yourself. Then the question became, who is my neighbor? And I think that is the critical crux of what it is that we're trying to address today, is who is my neighbor? One of my favorite sociologists, for me a theologian as well, was W.D. Du Bois, who said at the beginning of the 20th century, the greatest problem of the 20th century will be the color line. I think in the 21st century, that is still the case. I want to begin to talk about the basic underlying ideology for me with the public theology and urban ministry from a Christian perspective is the 5 principles, primarily that Dr. King used, but he drew from a philosopher by the name of Josiah Royce, who considered himself an idealistic pragmatist. And he had 5 basic principles, and some of this is what you have been talking about all along. The first principle is that in a beloved community is ruled by both mercy and justice. The 2 sides of the same coin, mercy and justice. The second, which I think is critical underlying this, is the notion that each and every one of us are created in the image of God and therefore has ultimate worth. This was really the grounding of Martin Luther King's notion of the beloved community, which he grounded in the philosophy of personalism. That each person is of ultimate worth because we're created in the image of God. And that means whether you're black, white, whatever it is, in order to really to know God, you need to appreciate the color, the personality, and the personhood of every individual because we all created in the image of God. Another basic tenet of it, and I think this is a critical one, is when we start talking about the division within our society, is that we all are part of the same story. We have a common memory and a common future. And the purpose of theology, the purpose of the church is to be a community of interpretation. That is, no matter how you began, what your story is, when you enter into a community that's a beloved community, your past and your future are interpreted for hope. That's critical. And then one thing that you talked about before is that we are loved unconditionally and forever. I used to like what Rudy Rasmussen says over at St. John's, that I love you and there's nothing that you can do about it. Now that's a critical statement, I think, that encapsulates what real love is that doesn't mean that you accept the malfeasance, so to speak, or the errors. You accept those, but you love folks anyway. Okay, because that person's of ultimate worth. So that for me is the basis of my theology, for the public. Now, I'm a practical theologian, so it's not enough to create, philosophies that sound good, but how do you actually put that in practice? Which I think is the critical thing. And this is something that I have always been really trying to do, and that is to take theology and make it as practical as it could be. And let me talk about this just a little bit, and you can interrupt me anytime because I'll go on forever. I'm a preacher. I'm an ordained elder in the United Methodist Church, so I can go on forever. But my early part of my career, when I was working on my PhD at Emory in the 90s, there was crack cocaine had really began to ravage many of our communities, and mine in particular. My own nephew, Hyson, was murdered on the streets, Oakland, California, while I was working on my doctorate degree in Oakland, in Atlanta. And what it came to me was, at that moment in time, was that my philosophies and my theology had very little to do with what was happening on the streets in the community if I could not translate that into action. So working with the Methodist churches, we developed curriculum to mobilize congregations and churches to work in their community. And what I found theologically within those communities, there was a lack of hope. And so we created a curriculum called Revival of Hope that spread all over the country, and 33 coalitions, that began to mobilize over 2,000 churches, to begin to address, if they weren't already addressing, the violence and the substance abuse issue. That's just one example. The other, when I worked at the Carter Center, 25,000 young people were being killed by guns every year. And working with the CDC, we tried to figure out a way in which that we can begin to develop and to work with communities around the country to address the issue. And one of the things that we came up in the heart is that not one child's death is acceptable. And so we created a program called Not Even One that was built on what was called the Sentinel Events Response Team. And every time one child died in the community of gun violence, we would mobilize an interdisciplinary group of people from the housewife to the garbage worker to the policeman to the fire worker to the teacher, who would come together to do a public health investigation and to try to correct those things in the community that led to the death. One instance in Atlanta was done around a MARTA station, and because the grass was grown up and the lighting was bad, there was water taken care of, and the kids were being kicked out of school. Well, a coalition came together to hold accountable the property owners, to make sure that the yard was cleaned up, to go to the schools, to address programs for those kids who were kicked out of school, and address all those kinds of issues so that wouldn't happen again. So that is the kind of thing, for me right now, the critical issue is COVID-19 and the pandemic. And again, you can see it along these color lines. When the impact of COVID-19 is more prevalent in communities of color, and the ability to receive the vaccine is far lagging behind, the dominant culture for those things for me are not just accidents. They're part of systemic racism, that color line that is built in our community. Now I'm gonna stop right there. That gives you kind of a sense of how
Very good, Fred.
Theology.
Very, very good. Let me ask a question, because I think when you were talking, what it really brought to mind, and you and I are both young enough to understand the context of which this question comes. How does the church, when I say church, parish, temple, synagogue, and mosque, how does the church become essential again? The church was essential in the 60s and 70s, even somewhat in the 80s. Then the struggle for racial justice, social justice, for civil rights, for women's rights, the church was essential. And I use the word essential on purpose, because in this COVID-19 shutdown, liquor stores were deemed essential and stayed open and were allowed to stay open. Churches were shut down. Now, I know it's a play on things here a little bit, but the voice of the church, the prophetic voice of the church that we need today, we're not hearing it from all denominations. We're not hearing it from any denomination. We keep talking about this need for civility. For there to be civic civility, there has to be prophetic civility. And civic civility will never get anywhere if prophetic civility is not leading it, because the us and the them is so deep. The divide is so deep. So I keep looking for those voices that we heard in the 60s, the consistent, everyday voices of the 60s, the John Lewis's voices of the 60s, the King's voices, all those voices of the 60s that you heard it over and over every day. You don't hear that today.
Well, you have to first of all remember that even in the 60s, those voices were a minority voice within the church.
Yeah, but they still were a loud voice.
They were a loud voice, because of the actions that were taken, and because of the good trouble that they were getting into. They were on television, oftentimes the voices was heard in times of crisis, within communities. And you hear those voices today around Black Lives and around, many of the shootings and so forth that were shot. The voices were there, they were just not amplified. Okay.
Yeah, and they go up and they go down, and they come back up and they go down. So the consistency is what's important.
Well, I am the church. Okay. And for me, I don't put the blame on anybody else.
Oh, this is not blame.
I mean, not blame. I don't put the onus or put the responsibility on any other voice other than my own. To have a prophetic voice means that you hear from God and that you speak what God is saying. And I believe that those voices are not being amplified, but they exist today. And I think it's incumbent upon me, to be that prophetic voice. And the prophetic voice, basically the task is when all hope is gone.
Right.
When all hope is gone, we can still proclaim the rationality of what many people think is irrational. We can still talk about what is possible when other folks think it's impossible, because we don't rely on ourselves, but we rely upon the power of what God is doing. And we need to speak that and to speak that. And I believe some of that is happening, not enough of it. It's not amplified, but I think the kind of thing that you're doing is critical.
Well, thank you. But you raised this in the conference that I mentioned in April of 2018. Basically, and it was all denominations present. Mm-hmm. And what I thought was interesting, you were posing basically the question I'm asking today: what is the fair, moral, and ethical treatment of all human beings?
Yes.
What does that look like, feel like, act like? Can we get a baseline understanding and baseline agreement of what that? What is the fair, moral, and ethical treatment of all human beings? Now, if we can get across the board some understanding and definition of that, Now I can talk about the two antecedents that go with that. All human beings' lives matter. All human beings are equal, right? But if I can't get in agreement on the first main body question, the other two have no place to go. And that's where we find ourselves today. We still have not been willing. Notice it doesn't say we're capable and able. We're not willing to have that conversation and to come up with what that baseline looks like. So we keep going back, and I said this earlier, I'm going to keep saying it all my life. Why do we love charity so much? We're in love with charity because we refuse to do justice. We refuse to even think about what justice looks like, feels like, could act like. And so this complete commitment to downstream thinking rather than upstream thinking, eradication, policy change, systemic change at the top. We're going to wait till the bodies come flowing down the river, and then we're going to do our thing, as we've always done our thing. And guess what? Our parents have done it, our grandparents, our kids and great-grandkids are going to follow and do the same thing.
You know what? Today I was doing my meditation, and the basis of the meditation was today is a new day. It's a fresh day. It's not like yesterday, and it won't be like tomorrow.
Okay.
The question is, what are we going to do today?
What am I going to do?
And what I am going to do today. What are we going to do today? I think right now we are at an inflection point in history. We are. That's a time in history. History goes along on a curve, according to Sona Jonas, goes along the curve. At some point in time, it's broken open, where all the systems become unstable. And what people do at a time like now, you got a pandemic, you got political, separation, upheaval, you got climate change. All of those things are coming together at one time. The question is, what are we going to do today? Okay, how are we going to move forward today? And it doesn't depend upon everybody. It doesn't depend upon the masses of folks. As I mentioned before, the folks here in Houston, did not want Martin Luther King to come to town. There's only 3 or 4 pastors in this whole city. Lawson, and a couple of others, that welcomed him into the city, but their voices were heard because they were doing something that nobody else had the courage to do. The same thing is going on in our Congress today, that people are fearful of their own well-being, their own futures, their own careers, and are not ready to become the martyr, to stand out and to risk something. Those folks risk something. So the question is, what are we willing to risk by standing up and moving away from the crowd and speaking prophetically and standing for those things? They killed King. They crucified Jesus. They beat John Lewis half to death.
Yeah.
Okay. Those folks put their lives on the line. And so the question is, not what everybody else is doing or what is how much are we willing to risk and put our lives, our livelihoods, our careers, and our futures on the line to stand up for what is right. And in a moment like now, with the pandemic raging, with the Great Depression, with the political uncivil war, that is happening in our country today, the question is, what are we willing to risk and what are we willing to do today to make a difference? Because that's when the voices become loud, and when they become heard, is when people are willing to make the sacrifice, to take the risk at their own personal risk, the risk of their families, Medgar Evers and others, to make a statement, to stand upon those principles that we are all created equal, we all are children of God, and that the community does not exist without both justice and mercy, and that we need to begin to speak and to tell the story that's more inclusive than the one that's been up to now. So to me, that's the critical question. I don't know if we'll ever find a time when Martin Luther King and others began to talk about the beloved community. They never said that there was one that existed.
No, they didn't.
You can't find one anywhere. They never waited for one to exist. They said, go out and create it. So the question for me now is where you can find a baseline or where you can see it. The question is, what are we going to do to create the vision of the beloved community that is lifted up in all of our scriptures?
Well, we got to have
Muslim, Christian, Catholic, so forth. All of them have a vision of a beloved community, and all are given by prophets, and all of them had to speak those things at great risk to themselves. because you're right. The world is not going to take it, because we're born. I think guess you're talking about, we're born as selfish creatures. You know, that fear is our first response.
Yeah.
You know, to any kind of change.
Survival.
But those who are able to say, well, whatever happens to me, you know, this is what I believe and this is what I'm going to do, you know, to make it happen. So I think already, you know, what you saw in you know, I know you want that political, we saw in the last thing, what happened in Georgia. I lived in Atlanta for a long time. Most of my time was been in Georgia. I would have never have imagined 2 senators, a Jewish and a black one, you know, coming out of Georgia and
Right.
and voting for a Democratic president. I would have never imagined that, but it happened.
Right.
It happened because Stacey Abrams and some black women stood up and said, we're going to make a change today. Don't depend upon what happened in the past or what people think about us. It's what we do today. And I think that's what's going to have to happen now. And this is the opportunity for it to happen. When things are right now in flux and the systems are unstable, it's going to be necessary for people like yourself and myself to say, I don't care about what happened yesterday or what anybody else is doing. This is what God is telling me to do, and I'm going to put myself forward in doing that.
All right, my friend, I know we could go on and on and on, but we're getting close to that end. So before we run out of time, since we soon will be in the holy season of Lent, you have a great Lenten thing coming up. That I want people to know about and can hopefully get in touch with and follow. So before we run out of time, to give us a little thing about the Lenten series. Yeah,
it's called Covered by the Blood. You know, and it is a project that faith communities began at Ash Wednesday to begin praying and fasting, you know, for God to deliver us from this pandemic. But not only do that, to begin to actively bless through rituals, healing services, and others, that people begin to take the vaccine despite their doubts or their disbeliefs. After we've done due diligence, of course, after we've answered all the questions that needs to be answered in the doctors and public health, and we begin to understand it, to say that this vaccine is a God sent, because it's going to save lives, you know, and it's going to keep people healthy. And I think this is a responsibility of the church, is to be a house of healing. Right. You know, it's to be a place where we're supposed to get healing. And I think the medicine and religion have always been like this. Before, the doctors were the ministers, right. You know, because of the trust. And I think we've separated it, you know, faith and health on one side. For me, that great conference you're talking about was how you bring those back together again. You know, and I think this is an excellent opportunity to do that. And when we do that, we don't just deal with the vaccine, we deal with all those underlying conditions. Right. We deal with the social determinants of health, housing, education, jobs, and ecological racism that's caused us to have the underlying conditions, and it caused us to have the most mortality and morbidity rates among those people of color and poor. Because we can't just get out of this pandemic and think it's all over with. This could be a time where the church can stand up and make a voice, first of all, by getting vaccines in the arms of as many African Americans and people of color as possible, so they can become healthy at the end of this pandemic, but then to begin to go after those issues that cause the problem in our communities in the first place. And we can mobilize to do that. It's called Covered by the Blood. Starting at Lent, have a season of prayer and fasting, and then at Passover, have a Passover meal and begin to recite that and think about how the blood of the Lamb was covered under the post and the death angel passed over. Have a service on Good Friday, a memorial in memory. We need to remember all these people who are dying. Right. They have names, they have families. They're not just statistics. And we need to have lamentations for them. And then on Sunday morning, have a great getting up service, a resurrection service, and announce and proclaim in the name of Jesus that this pandemic is over. I think it's time for us not to just accept what is happening to us, but to take an active role, you know, to begin to address the pandemic, the public health issues, the vaccine, or whatever it takes. So that's basically what it's.
And I think tying it into the Lenten season, the Passover season, and actually Ramadan comes in there also.
Yes.
Tying in all those traditions and seasons together is exactly the thing to do. So tell us how, and they can get hold of you and get hold of the whole Lenten series.
Okay, well, my email address, I guess you can, is fdsmith62@gmail.com. Also, the Institute for Spirituality and Health, I'm working with Stuart Nelson and John Graham as well.
Yep.
You know, they will also be familiar with it. I'm also working with the University of Houston. We're having a summit on February the 19th, where it's calling together leaders from around Houston to deal with all these different issues. Of course, they're not going to be talking about covered by the blood, but they're going to be dealing with the vaccination, the testing, and the mental health issues.
Right.
So there's momentum that's growing, and I'm with Holman Street. Another place to go where I'm office at is Holman Street Baptist Church. I don't have the number with me right now in front
That's
of me.
all right. We know Holman. Our
Yeah,
good friend Manson Johnson was a pastor for years. My classmate, my friend, my buddy in the American Leadership Forum. Wonderful, wonderful leader, spiritual leader.
He was my mentor and my father in the ministry, and really I got that whole idea of covered by the blood from him.
Yeah, yeah. And the work that you and I are doing together, Institute for Spirituality and Health, is also very important. Because as you said, trying to bring those things together and not have spirituality and health be seen as two separate buckets or two separate silos. Fred, I'm going to give you, and I mean this tightly, I'm going to give you a closing quick minute. Any closing comments that you want to make that we haven't touched on?
My hope, my prayer is that we take this Kairos moment, stand up for the principles of which we believe in, because the divide in our country now is not a political one. It's not just economic one. It's a moral one. Yep. It's a challenge for the church to take the moral high ground. Martin Luther King says that the arc of history, the moral arc of history is long, but it's bent towards freedom. And it's up to us to get upon that arc and to bend it in this direction.
All right. To support all the work we're doing at the Institute for Spirituality and Health, the work that Fred is doing, I'm doing through race reconciliation and response, the Caring Hearts Foundation, which is the gala for the Institute for Spirituality and Health, takes place February 11th to the 18th. You can go to the website, spiritualityandhealth.org/caringheart. spiritualityandhealth.org/caringheart. We look forward to you joining us Zoom-wise and virtual celebration of Caring Hearts. I want to thank very much my good friend Fred Smith, Reverend Dr. Fred Smith, for being my guest today. And Fred, let's close out, and I'm not going to do it honor, and you may help me do it a better justice and honor, but I want to close out anyway because I think it's fitting for everything we've been talking about today. It's really about what we're going to do. It's what I'm going to do. It's what we're going to do. And the best way I know to sum that up has always been in the form of the old Negro spiritual. Hush, hush, somebody's calling my name. Come on, Fred. Hush, hush, somebody's calling my name. Hush, hush, somebody's calling my name. Oh my Lord, oh my Lord, what shall I do? What shall we do?
Amen.
That's what it's always been.
That's right.
That's what it still is.
That's exactly right.
And we want to make it complicated. We want to make it like brain surgery, but it's really quite simple. The age-old calling. Age-old calling. Simon Peter, son of John, do you love me? Yes, Lord, you know that I love you. Then feed my lamb, feed my sheep, take care of my people. This is not difficult, people. This is not hard. If you have the will and the wanna. Right, Fred? The will and the wanna. You have to have both.
With the help of God, you can create the kind of world that God's intended for you to live in.
Amen. All right, Fred, they're telling me we got to get out of here.
All right.
It's been great. It's been wonderful. Thank you for being on Dialogue Houston. Look forward to having you on in the future.
Thank you.
So everyone, please stay well, be safe. And until we come together again, peace, power, and love.